Uncle Tuggs. 1. Now, you should understand that when Gabe Tuggs offered me this job, I didn't like the idea of working for him. I didn't like getting into any kind of deal with any of those 3 Tuggs brothers. But right then my bank account was hurtin' for certain. I'd had like a great burst of energy take hold of me when I made so much money landscaping that spring. I started building that cabin Barbara's always bitching about. And with the kids getting so big now, the trailer does seem small, even with all the little rooms I've tacked onto it. Anyway, I'd poured the slab and had the package of 2x4s delivered. So right then, early that fall, there was a little freak rain and the job calls stopped dead. A lot of people are just looking for any excuse to put off having work done till next spring. I'd been 2 weeks without a nibble. I still owed on the 2x4s, and we had big dentist bills, and both my stake bed and my pickup needed new sets of tires. So, when Gabe Tuggs came and found me in the 8-ball off Courthouse Square and offered me this job, I said, I said to him, "Gabe, why don't we have another beer while I weigh it in my mind?" Gabe used the cast on his left hand for a hammer on the bar. He ordered 2 beers. "And a shooter of bourbon with mine, Lloyd," I told Lloyd. Gabe didn't say anything, just paid. He was tight-fisted, so I could see now he really meant to talk business. The job was cutting 50 or 60 trees on Uncle Tuggs's place to firewood, and I liked the deal. But I took my time drinking. I didn't want to answer too fast. I sat there a bit, like I was just relaxing and savoring Lloyd's god-awful house bourbon. Of course, the truth was, I never could feel very relaxed sitting next to Gabe Tuggs. It's true he was the smallest of the 3 brothers. He stood not a hair over 6 feet 2 and was scarcely a yard wide. And if he weighed an ounce over 240, I'd eat the difference, and a nasty meal it would be. The thing was that what Gabe lacked in size, he made up in meanness. His cast covered up one of his gaudier tattoos, but he had plenty of others showing, 3 color tattoos with lots of teeth and tails and claws in them. A kind of burnt leather and motor oil smell came off of Gabe. His ponytail even had a kind of motor oily look, and he always wore shades that were as black as a bug's eyes. He was the kind of guy that sitting next to him made you uneasy, like sitting next to a bear. But anyway, I did like the deal. I could take 1 quart out for every quart I left to them. In October, I could already get $140 for a cord that was only half splitters. If I pushed it, I could truck out 2 of those a day. I also trusted the deal. I didn't trust the brothers, you understand. I trusted their situation, which was plain to anyone who thought about it. Since moving on to their Uncle Tuggs's place to caretake after he disappeared, they would have planted every shed and barn on it cram full of prime skunkweed. No doubt of it. It'd be safe indoors from theft and law, and it'd be the readiest big cash they could make off the property. So, waiting for harvest, with the grow lights working overtime, they'd need cash in the short term for gas, drugs, booze, and food. What to do? Chop up and sell old Uncle's oaks and madronas. The boys would be living off all that wood all through winter and spring. They'd have to play straight with their cutters and customers. And this was twice as true just now, with both Grant Tuggs, the oldest, and now Gabe, too, injured like they had been, and within a week of each other. Knowing Gabe from high school wouldn't have counted for anything if they'd wanted to cheat me, but their having to depend on that firewood for their octanes and their Jack Daniels and their elephant tranquilizers, that was what made me say to Gabe, "Well, Gabe, I believe I could take on that job. Do I understand rightly that you've cut some kind of road so I can get my stake bed down into the draw?" I knew Uncle's place since high school, from having my cars up there to be fixed from time to time, like a lot of people. It was 6 or 7 acres, with the house and barn and sheds on about a half-acre of fairly level ground not far off the highway. Behind that the land dropped away to hilly ground, with several draws winding through it, with plenty of trees growing in them, with lots of mid-sized, scraggly stuff, perfect for weeding out for firewood. Gabe looked pissed at my question. He hammered the bar with his cast again. He said, "We got a road cut down into the first draw. Goddamn dozer broke down right at the bottom. Still sitting there, but you can get around it." "Same," he told Lloyd. I was impressed. I mean that he bought me another drink like that. I could see the boys really wanted someone they could trust on this job. I said, "Boy, that's too bad. You guys really seem to be having some bad luck lately. How's Grant doing?" I didn't quite dare ask about his break, but I looked at his cast when I asked about Grant's. He gave me that black bug eye like he was considering how it would be to twist my scalp off like a beer bottle cap. Though I'm kind of short, my cap's on pretty tight and might give him some trouble. It would sure hurt like hell to have him trying it out, though. Finally, not moving his lips much, Gabe says, "They're changing his cast tomorrow." Gabe had actually thought Grunt's accident was pretty funny when he had it, back before Gabe was hurt himself. He described it to Billy Vale, who he'd sometimes drink with, and Billy Vale described it to me. Old Grunt was what we all called Grant behind his back, Grunt decided to split up a heap of rollers they had by the house, so their own stoves would be taken care of. Now, Grunt had plenty of back for labor, but he didn't like it any better than his brothers did. So when he got inspired to some kind of work, he liked to jump on it, power through it, and get it over with. So Grunt honked up a couple of foot-long rails of crank, and had 5 or 6 shooters of Cuervo gold, and munched down some salt and lime slices, and fired up the splitter that old Uncle Tuggs had left behind, like he'd left behind most all his other gear when he disappeared. Grunt starts plunking those rollers into the splitter and gets such a rhythm going that in no time he finishes the pile. Grunt's breathing fire by now. He jumps into Uncle's old stake bed, which the front brakes are just about shot on, but what the hell, and goes jouncing down their little road cut and into the draw. He lays about him with the chainsaw and drives up another heap of rollers. He does some more shooters, munches a bunch more of salt and lime slices, honks a couple more rails of crank, and fires the splitter back up. He starts feeding it rollers from off the truck bed, turning back and forth between the bed and the splitter. Well, the splitter's wheels are locked, but you know how they can creep sometimes? Except this one practically jumps, swings one end all the way around behind Grunt's legs, so that he trips and falls backwards across it as he turns from the truck with another roller. To top it off, just then the wedge goes into drive, and Grunt swore he never touched the drive lever when he fell, and it's hard to see how he could have. If he hadn't had so much crank in him, he'd never have hoisted his legs out of the way in time, and as it was, one of his feet snagged and the wedge nipped him just hard enough to crack his shin bone. Anyway, I just shook my head sympathetically about Grunt's cast and all. "Well, Gabe," I said, "I like your offer. I want to leave early enough each day to take my buyers their wood straight off my truck so I don't have to stockpile." "Long as you leave the same amount you leave with every day, I give a shit. I want to start tomorrow morning. I'll be out to mark the trees for you." I wanted to ask him what he was going to do, take a bite out of each one he wanted cut. "What about trucking your cords for you?" I asked him. "Will you want to hire me for that? I mean, since your truck's out?" I thought this might make Gabe mad again, because that was how he got hurt, you see, trying to change the front brake shoes on that truck, but he surprised me. He kind of looked off into the air. "Who knows," he said. "Maybe we won't want to sweat the work ourselves. Let's just get some cut first. And remember, you're making 2 cords of splitters for us, too." "No problem. I can use your splitter?" Gabe shrugged. "If you want." I wasn't sure I did want. I worked on my drink, thinking how it was no wonder the brothers seemed ready to hire out all the work, even selling their own cords. First you had their trouble with that splitter, then you had Gabe's accident. He'd got that truck's front end up on Uncle's roll-under hydraulic pump jack, laid under there and started hammering off the front left drum with a blunt chisel and a hand sledge. He'd told Billy Vale this one, too, but he didn't laugh as much, telling it as he did about Grunts. All of a sudden, whoosh, the pressure blows out of the jack and the truck sits on Gabe's face. He was lying on thick grass, and he had the wheel lying under the axle, so his head wasn't mashed, but one of his hands got caught half raised, and he cracked 2 of the bones in it. And then on top of all this, there was their grader breaking down, which I hadn't heard about. Put it all together, it was starting to seem like everything old Uncle Tuggs had left on the place was giving the brothers trouble. When Uncle and Cherry, his little honey, and Ralph, his big, mean, smelly old dog, disappeared early last summer, he took nothing but his old black repair van with him. Every vehicle, tool, or component known to man, or pieces of it, was left on his place, though a lot of it was scattered or rusted or hidden in a pile of parts, and none of it seemed to be doing the boys any good. I got up. "Well, okay, Gabe," I told him. "I'll see you in the morning. You guys hear anything from the sheriff yet?" This question actually seemed to startle Gabe for a minute. That might seem odd, since it was him and his brothers that had got the official search for Uncle started in the first place. Of course, they'd been waiting 2 months now with no results. Add to that the fact that it had been 3 months longer yet since Grant Tuggs had been the last person to see Uncle alive, and maybe Gabe's reaction wasn't really so odd. The boys must just have given up any hope of ever seeing Uncle again, and must not even be thinking about it any more. "Hell," Gabe said after a minute, "they haven't found jack shit." As I drove home, I thought about the job and got more and more pleased with it. There were mucho cords in those draws. Once I got home, I hadn't been on the phone 15 minutes before I'd sold 3 cords, COD, as soon as I could deliver. 2. A little after sunrise, I drove my stake bed up to Tuggs's yard. I knew that place pretty well, as I say, and right then, in that early sunlight, it seemed like a lot of years since I'd started bringing my first car up here, an old Plymouth. Hell, 20 years at least, in plain fact. In those days, the brothers might be around, but it was Uncle everyone came up here to see. The boys had never lived here before now. When you thought about it, it was kind of funny, actually, that being called Uncle was the old man's own joke, from his kid sister having 3 such big sons. He'd sure stuck by the joke. I couldn't recall any other name for him. But the thing was, he was just the opposite of a family-minded man. He'd let his nephews hang around his place, but even though their mother did a lot of moving and drinking and remarrying, and they got shuffled around a lot, he'd never take them in even temporarily. He probably figured she'd try to scrape them off on him, and he probably was right. But even so, I could remember thinking it was funny how he didn't even seem to feel like an uncle towards them, even though he'd let them use his tools and fix their heaps at his place. For instance, there was that accident with Ronnie Partlet that had made Gabe Tuggs kind of famous when we were back in high school. He and Ronnie stole a bottle of bourbon from Gabe's stepdad and took Ronnie's mom's car and were driving all around one Friday night, smashing mailboxes with a baseball bat they'd stolen from the school gym. Well, Gabe was driving, and Ronnie was leaning way out with the bat to smash a bunch of boxes that they were just coming up on, and all of a sudden a cat shoots across the road, and Gabe swerves to mash it, and poor Ronnie's head is jammed into those mailboxes. Gabe got a year on the youth farm, and I remember being up here a couple of days later and hearing Uncle talking about it with some other old fart that he was fixing his tractor for. The other guy said that Ronnie was no better than a vegetable now for all intents and purposes, and Uncle laughed and said, "Yeah, but you had to be fair to Gabe, because Ronnie hadn't had that far to go in the first place," which was God's truth. What struck me just then was how Uncle said it, like he saw Ronnie and Gabe on a par, and didn't feel any more involved with one than the other. What Uncle did, even more than working here at his place, was ride a kind of circuit mechanics route in an old black van jammed with tools. Back when I was a kid, he was already a strange, tall, skinny old guy that everybody's grandfather liked to joke and cackle with, and everybody's grandmother disapproved of as being foul-mouthed, but was also a little secretly tickled by. He was kind of like an old-time circuit preacher that prayed over cars and graders and trucks. He'd stand talking over an engine, jawing with the owner as long as he ever spent touching it. But then, finally, just here and there, he'd give a little dab with a wrench, a little poke with the screwdriver, and baroom! The thing would be humming, like a laying on of hands. Also, the old goat always had some much younger woman, or Chippy, as some people's mothers called him, living up here with him. He was a greasy, gangly, bump-throated old guy. He had a big spade-shaped nose that came all the way down past his mouth, or seemed to. His mouth was wide, without all its teeth, and when he wasn't talking, when he was looking at an engine and thinking, his eyes far away, he had the sort of secret lemon-sucking smile that always, as long as I could remember, set my teeth a little on edge. As I got older, and he got older, it surprised and irritated me more and more that he always had these younger women living with him. If after a while one of them stopped showing up around his place, no more than a week or so would pass, and he'd have another one out there with the same nice big advantages on her as the one before her had. What sort of rubbed it all in, you might say, was that he loved to talk about what he did in bed with them, or talk about what he'd like to do in bed with them, or talk about what he'd like to do in bed with any other woman who came to mind, or came in sight at any moment. Old Uncle Tuggs liked to talk about screwing, or possible screwing, or even impossible screwing, in any way, shape, or form. The thing was, he had a talent for it. He had such a humorous, greedy, descriptive way of talking about it that you just had to listen and laugh. But it sort of hit me just then, looking at his old place, that I'd never really liked Uncle Tuggs. It surprised me. I guess I always knew I didn't like him, but the fact never stood out for me to notice it like it did now. There was something about him that I always thought was just like Ralph, his dog. In the first place, it seemed like Ralph had been old and mangy from the first day I laid eyes on him, and yet there he still was, just last winter, and not looking that much older when you thought about it. That was just like Uncle himself. And then Ralph was so big and so bony. That was like Uncle, too. But most of all, Ralph had this sneaky, hungry air about him. I mean hungry in some kind of strange way you couldn't quite put your finger on, with a way of hanging back, circling you, his eyes always spying sideways at you and laughing. And that was definitely like Uncle. That was him to a T, in just a slightly less obvious way. Gabe came out of the barn. He had 2 chainsaws by their grip bars in one hand, and a can of gas under the arm with the cast. As I pulled up to let him in, I could see into the barn and see where the boys had walled off a back part of it, so I knew they were probably growing dope back there, too, as well as in all the sheds. You could hear a generator going somewhere. Walter had been into town to buy a new one, so the one Uncle had left must have broken down. Gabe got in, and I drove us down past the old stake bed, sitting nose to the grass where the jack gave out, and down to the edge of the nearest draw. The road cut down into it was rough, and that little John Deere was right bang at the bottom of it, its skip-loader shoved halfway into the dirt for another bite when it died. You had to admit it was bizarre. The last time it had been used before that, it had worked fine. Grant had come up to grade off some old weedy dirt piles from a cellar and septic tank, dug years before. I guess Uncle just didn't feel like doing it himself for some reason. And that, in fact, was the last time anyone had seen Uncle, because when Grunt came back the next day to finish up, he said he found Uncle, Cherry, Ralph, and the van all gone. Anyway, 3 months later, after the brothers decided it was time the law looked into this, and a lot of people by this time were wondering, and after the sheriff okayed their caretaking the place, they no sooner fired the John Deere up again to develop the property's cash potential a little, and bam, it breaks down. I was just able to edge my truck out around it and onto the draw bottom. "Well, Gabe," I told him, "this gravel feels pretty firm. I shouldn't have any trouble getting down draw ways." "Forget it. You're cutting up here. Just get all these fuckers at the head of the draw here." Old Gabe sure had a friendly, winning way about him. Why the hell did he need to mark the trees at all, if that was what he wanted? Turned out, as I was breaking out my 12-pack of buckhorn, rolling up my sleeves, and firing up the bigger chainsaw, that he didn't bother with marking trees, just took one of my beers and sat on a rock and started watching, like I was free TV. I went to work. I dropped a half-dozen smaller trees that would be in the way of falling the bigger ones later on. I trimmed the lettuce off them and dragged it out of the way and started cutting them into rollers. All this time Gabe was watching me, looking broody. After a while I see it's the chainsaw he's actually watching. After a half-hour or so he gets up, pins the other saw with his foot, and starts it with his good hand. "Hey," he tells me, "use this a while. I don't like that one to overheat." Well, this is bullshit. The saw was fine. But I didn't want to lose my stride, so I just put the one down, took the other, and kept going. Gabe took another one of my beers, sat down on a madrona I'd cut, and started watching that saw. After a while, I stopped for a rest. "Mind if I switch back to the big one now, Gabe?" I asked him. "It goes faster." Sullen, like it hurt his mouth to ask it, Gabe said, "Seem to you like either one of them pulls?" "Pulls? Left or right?" "Left or right," he shouts. I'm surprised how suddenly worked up he was. "Up or down, pulls any direction." I waited a minute. "Why, no, Gabe," I said very calmly. "I've got to say I haven't felt either one of those saws pull particularly in any direction at all whatsoever." He just grunted, but I could have sworn he looked relieved. I went back to work with the bigger saw, and he didn't mention overheating any more. Gabe watched and drank my beer. I had figured a 12-pack would last me till lunch, but the cheap bastard drank 3 of my beers, and by 11 I'd run dry. I made a big deal about emptying the last can, but hints are wasted on any Tuggs. Just then, from up at the house, came the sound of someone firing up a car, and I said to Gabe, "Is that Walter? Going out? Could you get him to bring back another 12-pack? "Walter's not here. That's Grant. He won't be back till late. He's going to get his cast changed." "Well, have you got any beers in the house, Gabe? It's getting kind of thirsty out, and it looks like I've just run dry." Good old Gabe just shrugged. "Fuck if I know," he said cheerfully. I went back to falling some more trees. I decided at noon I'd drive out for another 12er, and this one I was going to lock in my cab and take out can by can, so that even a Tuggs would get the point. And then the strangest thing happened that I've ever had happen with a chainsaw, and I mean including the time I lost this joint of my finger here, right? I'd started on this little oak, you see. It had 2 main branchings that pushed out at its neighbors so as to give it a tricky kind of torque, but it had a definite lean out over the draw bottom that should control its fall. Well, what happened was that when I touched the saw to begin the undercut, the saw had an incredible power surge, and ripped clear through the trunk with one backhanded stroke. Now, this can't happen. Certainly not on an undercut like that. The shift and pinch of the trunk, as its support gets cut through, would trap the biggest saw just like that. You have to get the weight of the tree hanging with the undercuts, but then you cut through the back of this truss, and the tree snaps forward off the saw. That's the only way to do it. Except it did happen. Can you picture the kind of acceleration I'm talking about? The blade just roared straight through the tree. I'd still swear that kind of power just physically was not in that saw. It sliced the trunk at a crazy angle, and the tree pitches down, flips off the hang-up of one of its boughs on the next tree, and twists sideways as it whops down the rest of the way, bang square on the tree that Gabe was perched on. Gabe had lots of fast in him, like all the Tuggs. He'd just jumped off when the oak came down and clamped him face down across the madrona, chest and right arm pinned, head and left arm poking out on the other side. And as if things weren't strange already, the impact itself was strange. The oak fell on one of its two branchings, which snapped but didn't break off, and acted like a kind of hinge, letting the oak down just enough to pinch Gabe solid, but also giving just enough support so that no more than 2 or 3 of his ribs were cracked at most. When his head cleared and his eyes focused again, he started to swear something terrible. "God damn, Gabe," I told him. "You weren't just woofing when you asked about it pulling. Did you see how this thing yawed on me?" Gabe kept on swearing, and it sounded weird because what he was saying was so fierce, yet his voice was almost quiet at the same time, because it hurt him too much to fill his lungs and roar. I was really sorry a thing like this had happened to a guy like Gabe, with me involved in its happening. Of course, he himself had seemed to suspect his chainsaws were acting up, but he was the kind of guy that if he broke a couple of his ribs, he was going to hold it against you no matter what. He just spent too many of his years running elephant tranquilizers and crystal meth with other crazy bikers and doing them to have much sense of the fine points of a case left in him. I studied how to cut him free. "Look here, Gabe," I told him. "A lot of the weight's from this other side branch here. I'll lop it off, and maybe the oak will rise off you some." "Cut me the fuck out of here, you fucking clown! Ow!" Gabe said. He'd shouted too loud. I laid the blade to that side branch, and the saw sank through it smooth and normal as you please. A good 300 pounds weight dropped free. But goddamn if that oak didn't lift at all. By some freak twist in it, the trunk actually seemed to press a shade harder on poor Gabe. "Well, at least this saw's behaving okay now, Gabe," I told him. "I guess I'll try cutting that branch above you, and maybe then I'll be able to—" "Get this thing off me!" Gabe screeched, and then had to groan, it hurt so much to screech. The branch wasn't a main one, but was hefty, and I might be able to push up the oak with it off, and just lift it enough for Gabe to pull himself out. His head stuck out just below and to one side of the branch, so I got on its opposite side and reached the blade up. "Keep your eyes shut," I advised him, "because this sawdust is going to be coming down around your head." Gabe just groaned again and ground his teeth. I gunned the saw and set it to the branch. Right there, right then, things started to go bad in a big way. It was like when I touched the saw to that branch, a kind of nightmare started and kept on getting worse and worse until, well, I'm going to describe it all to you in just the order it happened in. I touched the saw to the bough, right? It sinks maybe halfway in, lulling me, getting me off guard. And then it has another one of those unreal power surges. It whips, through the rest of the branch in a second. I can't unsqueeze the trigger. I can't let go the grip. Zip through the bough and on down. Chunk, zoom. Clean through poor Gabe Tuggs's neck. That saw moved so fast that Gabe's head and the bough hit the ground at just about the same second, and I just had time to free my hands and pull back before the branch hit my arms, and it did hit the chainsaw right where I dropped it and smashed it dead. I stood cursing, but I was in kind of a trance, too. I walked around the trees, and on the other side of them I walked up and down, helpless, shaking my head and swearing. I was using my voice to drown out the awful noise of Gabe's bleeding on the other side of that tree sandwich. From this side, he might just be some guy peacefully bent over a fence or something that you were seeing from behind, except for that oak tree on him, of course. But I could still see in my mind the horrible way he was cut off short on the other side. I made myself stand still. I took a deep breath and blew it out. "Brother," I told myself out loud, "this is the worst luck you've ever had in a long and distinguished career of bad luck, and you better get a grip on yourself, because now you have really got your ass in a crack." I never talked to myself out loud like that, and the fact that I was doing it just shows how blown away my mind was. But somehow it helped me, and so I went on. "You're going to have to hide poor Gabe, bury him, because there's no way Walter or Grunt Tuggs is going to accept a reasonable explanation of how this tragic mishap happened. So you're going to have to come in tomorrow and tell them that after Grunt left for the hospital, Gabe took off somewhere and still hadn't showed up before you left with your wood." I sounded reasonable to myself, and it got me moving. I went back around the trees, but I was still like in shock. All I could do for a while was stare at those remains and the horrible mess of blood they had sprayed on the ground and a lot of the wood. And then when I made myself move again, all I could think of to do was pick up poor Gabe's head by the ponytail and hide it in a manzanita bush. Pretty ridiculous, with the whole rest of him still clamped between those trees. The oak lay longwise on the madrona, almost aligned to it. To keep from binding the saw or from mangling the body any worse, the neatest way to cut him out would be to chop that oak to rollers from its crown, the nearest end. "All right, then," I told myself. "Chop it to rollers, pull him free, and bury him, and use the shovel to bury the blood, too. Then get the bloody rollers on the flatbed first, cover them with the clean ones you'll have just cut, and get the hell out of here before Grunt or Walter comes back." I felt encouraged. I was still making sense. Down the draw a little way was the mouth of a ravine that Grunt Tuggs had shoved the dirt piles into when he graded them off for Uncle. The loose heap spilled right out into the draw and should be easy to bury Gabe in. My mind felt like it was clicking again. I fired up the smaller saw and set to the crown of that oak, dropping it roller by roller. This saw hadn't acted up yet, but you can bet I kept it well away from me while I worked. I don't want you to think that all through this I wasn't feeling some personal regret for Gabe as a man. No matter what kind of scumbag a person might be, they have some human characteristics too, usually, and you should try to come up with these and give them their due when they pass on. So I tried to remember Gabe's high points while I worked, though after high school I pretty much lost touch with him, and only knew his doings by hearsay. I remember while I was still in the service hearing how him and Walter had got together as septic tank contractors. They and two guys they subbed part of their work to apparently had a knack for getting things out of the houses they worked at. Then there was a divorced lady and her daughters had a big place in the hills where these boys were setting a tank for an extra wing she was adding. Maybe the lady was too trusting, too sociable, but Gabe and the boys, who had some bottles on hand, let the day turn into a kind of wild party, and all four got sent up for rape forcible and rape statutory and breaking and entering and some other things. And from what I heard afterwards here and there, both Walter and Gabe used every opportunity to work on their rape techniques while they were in the joint. Well, after that, I seemed to remember they all got out of the joint within a year of each other. Grunt was already up country in another state for a second-degree murder, and got together on something. Yes, that would be the garage they leased near Courthouse Square in Healdsburg. Now, there was something you had to give Gabe credit for. He wasn't charged with anything on that one, though there were some Mexican car clubbers got shot outside of town by someone, and Grunt did go up again for receiving stolen goods. On the other hand, you couldn't really give Gabe too much credit for that, because everyone knew he would have gone up too if they'd been able to get enough evidence on him. Anyway, after that, Gabe and Walter were running crank down around L.A. I knew from Billy Vale, who'd met Gabe while he was in jail for it, and went in with him a while when Gabe went back to it after he got out. It began to sink into me how much the brothers tended to stay together in spite of their various adventures. Would they really buy my story that Gabe had just taken off? And wouldn't I have to get rid of his chopper to make them believe it, even for a little while? Could I ramp it up onto my stake bed and cover it with rollers? It made me feel a little panicky. Christ, could I get all this done in time? I raised my saw to start a new cut, and from up near the house I heard the roar of a car pull in. Oh, perfect. Oh, fine. That had to be Walter. I was so stupefied by this new bad luck I just kept cutting. I dropped a roller, started another one. I heard Walter's motor cut off, his car door bang shut, then a house door bang. I just kept cutting. 3. It was like one of those nightmares where you're supposed to be hiding from these people, but your cover is just too thin, and all the time you're really blatant. And somehow they keep on not seeing you, but at any second they just have to see you. I just kept standing there, cutting my way towards poor Gabe and the big red splotch on the ground in front of him. Up at the house another door banged. Over the saw, in a pause between cuts, I could just make out the sound of someone sifting through tools near one of the sheds. I was maybe 5 cuts from springing Gabe's trunk. Would my luck hold? After I hid him, I'd still have to get a shovel to cover the blood. I heard an engine fire up in the yard. It wasn't Walter's car. It was shriller. And then Walter howled, and I heard him screeching and swearing. It wouldn't be natural for me to ignore that noise. He'd expect me to come running up there to see what happened. For a minute, though, it was impossible for me to move. Every ounce of me was so unwilling to leave the body so obvious like that for anyone to see who came to the edge of the yard. But at last I made myself trot on up to the yard, the chainsaw idling in my hand. There was Walter, sitting by a rusty, stripped-down V8 engine Uncle had left sitting on a block of wood in the grass. One of his hands was bloody. Walter was clutching it and cursing a blue streak. And damned if the fan blades on that derelict weren't still spinning. What the hell happened, Walter? Walter was a lot bigger than Gabe, almost as big as Grunt, but he didn't wear his hair like his older and younger brothers did. His was dude hair, and his face was shaved, which lets you see all the dings and chunks taken out of it. Right now Walter Tuggs looked amazed. I was taking the fucking distributor cap. The fucking engine fired up. Jesus, Walter, that is bizarre. Walter looked at me. The whites were showing all the way around his mean little gray eyes. Between each word he said, his jaw kind of sagged, like it wanted to hang. Bizarre, he said. Bizarre? What the fuck do you mean, bizarre? I mean strange, Walter. I mean, Jesus Christ, that's strange. Strange? Strange? You're fucking A straight, it's strange. That sucker's amputated. There's no gas. What could I say? He was right. That fan had mauled a lot of skin off his knuckles, but it was that kind of thing that is so surprising that it blots out pain for a while. I still didn't like to see Walter Tuggs bleeding like that. In just pure disposition, you'd have to say he was the meanest of the brothers. True, he did skunkweed and reds to such an extent that a lot of the time he seemed more amazed than mean, but he had a way of getting confused, and if he stayed confused about any one thing long enough, then he turned mean. Luckily, his memory was so short he usually forgot what was confusing him pretty quick, but bleeding like he was likely to keep the confusing fact that a dead engine had mauled him on Walter's mind. But he didn't get steamed up. No, Walter surprised me. He looked at that V8 and said fairly quietly, "So fuck your fucking distributor. Be that way. I'll just go trim the fucking dope." Then he just turned and walked towards the tool shed. It was the oddest thing. like he had some running argument with that motor, or with something in it, an argument he was so involved in he didn't even notice he'd copped to their dope crop right in front of me. I figured I should keep an eye on Walter for a few minutes to see that he settled into something. I killed off the saw and set it down. I went to the shed where he was tying a rag around his hand and got out a double-bitted axe. "I'm going to do some of your splits now, Walter. Then I'm going to haul a load of rollers out of the draw for myself." He just shrugged. I went over to the rollers piled by the back porch near the splitter, which, the way things were going, there was no way I was going to use, and started setting them on end and splitting them. I warmed up to the axe work, and my mind started moving again. How big would their dope be? 2 months old, dating from the day they moved in. There'd be some spraying as well as trimming to do, and all those downers made Walter a slow worker. He'd be at it an hour. If I could just get back down to the draw for another 20 minutes, I could spring Gabe and hide him in the worst of the blood. Then I could settle to clean up in more detail, because then, even if Walter did come to the edge of the yard, he'd miss anything that didn't outright kick him in the face. So I kept splitting. I've always liked splitting madrona. It's so red the crosscuts look like steaks. It's crisp and kind of waxy and splits clean with one good stroke. Whack, plop, whack, plop, whack, plop. The splitters fell apart rosy and mellow in the sunlight. I was just starting to feel I might get out of this mess if I stayed cool. Meanwhile, Walter had found a pair of hand shears in the shed and was working them to get the rustiness out of them. He worked them and worked them, already looking like his usual vacant self again. In the noon quiet and the fine sunshine, the two of us made a funny, peaceful kind of music. Whack, plop, whack, plop, An inspiration came to Walter. He rummaged in the shed again and got a spray can of liquid wrench. Holding this, he wandered towards the barn, spraying the shears and still working them as he went. And right there, just as he got to the barn door, Walter had one of the strangest accidents I've ever seen. Not worst, but strangest, and coming from me, that ought to mean something. Maybe the shears were slipperier from the liquid wrench, but as he worked them faster, they suddenly snapped open so hard they flipped out of his grip, spun end over end straight down, and sank one blade all the way through Walter's shoe and foot, and it must have been another inch on into the ground. For a minute Walter froze. He stood and gaped at his foot like it had betrayed him. Then he hoisted the foot, shears and all, off the ground and started hopping around on his other foot and roaring. He roared some things there's no need to repeat, things and combinations of things that I'd never even thought of. The kind of things I guess you need a pair of shears through your foot to help you think up. I ran over to him. "Sit down, Walter, against the barn here." "That's it. Scoot back this way a little more. Lean back on the wall here. That's it." "Hold that knee straight now. Lock it," I told him. I planted one of my feet against his toes to hold his foot rigid, and then I hauled the shears out of him. He slammed the barn wall with his head, cracking one of the planks. When his eyes had cleared a little, he said, "In the kitchen. Counter. Jack Daniels." "Good idea," I told him. "Get your shoe off, and we can pour some in the hole." "Fuck the hole," Walter screeched. "I'm going to drink it." Just the same, he started working on his laces, and I hurried through the back door into the kitchen. And when I got to that J.D. bottle, I took some of Walter's advice and had a long pull off it. I found a sixer of buckhorn in their icebox and had one of them and half another as a chaser. I watched poor Walter from the window, loosening his shoelaces gingerly like they were snakes that might bite him. I took another pull, finished my beer, and cracked another. Can you believe a day like this? I asked myself. I felt like I was a stranger I had to give advice to and couldn't think of what to tell him. They talk about accident-prone? I asked. Those aren't just empty words. It seems like every tool or gadget on this place has it in for these boys. Just then the coldest kind of a shudder went straight through me. Up from the floor I stood on and right out through my scalp, and it was like Uncle Tuggs was standing right there with me. I was still looking out the window, seeing Walter ease his shoe off and get some reds out of his vest pocket and swallow them. But what I was really seeing was Uncle Tuggs's face. I was feeling him in my guts. The smell of his dirty kitchen was the smell of Uncle himself in my nostrils. And he had this particular look on his face that I'd seen there again and again over the years, and it hit me now that it was that look that somehow summed up old Uncle Tuggs, got right at the gist of him. It was the look he'd have when he'd just fixed some immediate problem on whatever car I had at the time. "Well, that takes care of that," he'd say. "But before long that X or Y of yours is going to go, and then you might as well just shit-can the whole rig." And we'd stand there, both of us knowing he was right, and both knowing I'd never have the money to fix that X or Y, and his oily black eyes would be laughing in just this particular way. And now I could feel the meaning in that look like never before, that deep inside Uncle gloated more over knowing how things broke than knowing how to fix them. It was truly scary. I could see Cherry, too, in a manner of speaking. With that same feel of the smell and rub of her. A little honey about my age, ex-flower child, with the kind of advantages on her that back in high school it would have blown every zit on my face to get my hands on. But her eyes were missing. Right at the centers they were dead and gone, so that you couldn't picture them. It really went through me. Uncle's other honeys, what about them? Could I remember their eyes? Walter was bellowing for me. As I took him out the whiskey and beer, I told myself, "Calm down now, just stay cool. This is actually good luck. He won't go wandering around now and look in the drawer." Walter got out some more reds and washed them down with the J.D. Then he drank a beer at one breath. He settled back against the barn and gave me a serious look. "This place, man," he told me, "is trying to ambush me. This whole fucking place." He looked off into space, nodding a sort of just-you-wait nod. He chugged more J.D. and brooded over his thoughts. Old Walter's thoughts, few though they might be, could often occupy him for hours at a time. Things were looking up. I'd work here just until I saw his reds kick in, then get down into the draw and clean up. "Listen, Walter," I told him, "you want to ride to the hospital? Because I'll take you down in my truck as soon as I make up a load. I'll split a few more here, and then I'll go down and make up the load." Walter nodded. He looked vague already. I went back to splitting. This shouldn't take long. Whack, plop. Then I'd come back here from the hospital after dropping him off. Whack, plop. Get Gabe's keys and just drive his chopper off the place. Whack, plop. Hide it somewhere nearby and run back. Honk. It was just the axe handle that I hit with that one, and it made my elbows pop. The head had flown off the handle slick as snot. It whistled, it spun so straight. It sank its whole length into the center of Walter Tuggs's chest. He'd been sitting with one hand laid sort of loose across his chest, and so two of his fingers got clipped off just as neat as you could imagine and rolled down onto his lap. Walter's eyes and mouth came wide open, he sat up, and then fell back stone dead. 4. It seemed like I'd never move again. Like the sun would set, the moon would rise, Grunt would come home and call the sheriff, and I'd just be standing there through it all, that axe handle in my hands, poor Walter in front of me, and poor old Gabe down in the draw, sandwiched between two trees with his head behind a manzanita bush. Except, of course, Grunt would just blow me away himself and bury me down in the draw. He'd make no bones about that kind of thing. And it seemed like I did stand there forever, and without a single idea in my head how to save myself. And then, straight out of that like trance, I started to move, to clean things up, and it was bizarre how smoothly I started doing everything, how suddenly I was moving and wasn't wasting a move. I tossed the axe handle in the tool shed, dragged out a piece of carpet Uncle had used to lie under cars on, took it over to Walter, tucked his 2 fingers into his vest pocket with his reds, and laid him on the carpet. It was amazing how little he bled, I guess because his heart had stopped pumping in a split second. I dragged him over to the road. Big though he was, it still seemed impossible one man could be so heavy. I dragged him down the road into the draw. I ran back up, got the J.D. and cans of beer, drained them all, and threw them on a trash heap with a lot of others of their kind. I got the chainsaw and a pick and shovel, and ran back down into the draw with them. I set them down near Gabe, grabbed Walter's rug again, dragged it as far as the manzanita, got poor Gabe's head by the ponytail, and put it on Walter's lap, and dragged both of them still deeper into the draw. Near where that slide was, where Grunt had dozed a gully full with Uncle's old dirt piles, was a clump of bushes, and I hid Walter and Gabe's head behind it. I ran back up the draw with the carpet, laid it near Gabe's feet, fired the chainsaw back up, and started to get the rest of the oak off him. I couldn't progress so fast in this part of the work. I forced myself to make 20-inch cuts because I'd need lots of clean rollers to hide the bloody wood in the truck, but I had to clench my teeth to keep from bellowing out the fear that was in me now. It was like being trapped in a film that had slowed down. All the shadows in the draw looked darker and cooler, and I overdrove the chainsaw to keep from hearing this bizarre, thick quiet that was welling like a flood out of the ground, like it might fill the draw and close over my head and snuff out even the chainsaw's noise like a candle flame. Crazy? I was crazy. I kept seeing Uncle, with Grunt, and after him the law to be afraid of, and all the tricky moves I had to plan. It was that old goat that kept pushing himself into my mind. Just like a goat, too, the way one might push its clammy muzzle against your hand, wanting something from you. It was a cold, sweaty nudge, his face shoved against my mind with a scary skin-rub feeling. For some reason it was from a particular recent period that I remembered him, from just a few years back when the brothers had their garage scam going down in Healdsburg. Uncle hadn't had any part in the boys' cheats, though he had to know about them, had to know that if some housewife stopped in with a nice new car, she'd drive it off with a big bill and with her carburetor and battery and what all replaced by used junk. He had to know about those rip-off contracts, too, the ones the boys had with those cholos that eventually got shot. None of that had anything to do with why Uncle sometimes hung around their place, why he sometimes donated his talent, and was probably the only reason why the boys had any straight customers at all after the first month or so. No, Uncle was there for something else. He was hanging around for the show, giving the boys set-up a shove now and then to keep it rolling, just like he'd give an engine that finicky kind of disdainful jab with a screwdriver or poke with a wrench. That was how Uncle had fun. People always assumed it was by tinkering things to life, but actually it was by keeping things going so that he could watch them dying longer. I dropped the piece that had Gabe pinned. He sagged down to his knees and flopped back on the carpet. Even so tragically shortened, Gabe was like an oak stump to pull, but now I felt like the film was speeded back up and I could move ahead of my feelings again. I left Gabe behind the bushes with his head and Walter. I ran back and grabbed the shovel. I started scooping sand from where it was thick on the draw bottom and slinging it over the drag marks and the bloody splotches and salting it over the bloody rollers. They looked crusty, but it killed the color. I tossed the smashed saw on the truck bed and started tossing those rollers on after it. Big sugary clots of sand drizzled off that raw meat madrona as it bounced on the bed, and in that late light it all looked like a nightmare you might have after gorging yourself on rare roast beef and jelly doughnuts. I had to rest before starting to throw the clean rollers on to cover the mess. I looked up and was completely stunned. The sun was setting. Just one red half of it was left, all webbed over by the black branches of oak trees. I jumped. I spun. I made those rollers rise and fly into the truck, but as fast as I could move wasn't half fast enough. The fear was truly big in me now, and still not of Grunt or the law, but of Uncle, like he could somehow catch up with me, grab me, and stop me dead in the middle of this awful work of mine. When the clean wood I'd cut was loaded, it wasn't enough to cover the mess, so I started lopping off some more. The first roller I dropped, the sun went with it. The sky was still light, but now all the shadows ran together in the draw. I gritted my teeth and kept cutting, and remembered Uncle's eyes. His eyes, as he'd been telling you where he'd like to stick his tongue and his fingers in some woman passing by just then. His little lemon-sucking smile as he told you about it, as he rubbed the balls of his mind against your ears, tinkering with your mind, just as he tinkered with his nephew's customers' cars, smiling as he watched the boys, so blatant and so dumb, hassle, cheat, steal, and strong-arm their way back to jail. His eyes as he sat in his van, fingering the back of Cherry's neck as they drove by, tinkering with her nerves as he steered, and her eyes while he did it, looking empty and dismantled, like clocks with their hands stripped off. I stopped cutting. I didn't really have enough, but to hell with it. I wasn't going to be able to make myself stay down here much longer. I killed the saw, loaded my cuts, and set in and bolted my truck's tailgate. I stood there in the quiet that had closed right back in like a pool, and in the shadows that now were also like a pool that I was sunk in way over my head, with my feet turned to lead. I didn't want to go down that draw to do my last piece of work. They lay there waiting for me to take hold of them and wrestle them into the dirt, and I had to say something to hold their silence off at arm's length. "Okay," I said. "There you boys lie, and I've got to bury you now, and get out of here fast. And first, I'm going to have to get your scooter's key out of your pocket, Gabe. I really hate doing this, but you know deep down that all this was a tragic mishap. I mean, if you know anything, you know that it's something Uncle—" I knew as I said it that I shouldn't say his name, and no sooner did I say it than he was there, standing right behind me. My heart nearly sneezed a piston. I screeched and jumped and spun around, and saw the drawer was empty. No one was there but me, my stake bed, and that busted John Deere. I stood down in that lagoon of shadows, my heart still thudding back into place, and listened to the cricket noise start nibbling at the edges of all that cold, creaky quiet. I shook myself. I took up the pick and shovel, and ran down to where the boys were hidden. It was eerie getting Gabe's key out of his pocket with his face staring at me from off to one side, where it sat on Walter's lap, but I got it and stood up. I felt wired to work again. Felt like with just a little more hustle I might still get my ass out of here alive. I grabbed the pick and swung it against that dirt slide. Burying them in that slide was one of those ideas that looks good at a fast glance, but the minute you start doing it you can see why it stinks. The loose dirt kept pouring onto what I'd dug out, as any idiot would expect from a slide. I swung the pick like a propeller, stabbed out dirt by the bushel with that shovel, ground my teeth and grunted and sweated, and all I was doing was dragging that whole pile farther and farther out onto the draw bottom. So I tried to put less back in it, eased the dirt out till I'd opened just enough of a notch in the slope to hide the boys in. I couldn't do it. The least little bit I moved them, the pick and shovel seemed to jump with it. They seemed to yank at my arms. My shoulders got sore trying to hold back their lunges at that dirt pile. I was staggering, swearing, and losing every single stroke of the battle. It was like fighting the buck of a power tool, and these were just dead wood and steel. Finally, I flung that shovel down, kicked it, cursed it, and stomped on it. I stood there trying to catch my breath, and right then, up by the house, I heard a car's engine cut off and its door open. 5. I was petrified. I'd totally missed any sound it had made coming in. I stopped breathing to listen. I heard the door thunk shut, and heavy limping steps move towards the house. I breathed again. Let Grunt get inside the house. Let him get inside and shut the door, I told myself. Then sling a pile on the boys just where they lie, enough to keep the flies off. Then fire up the truck and drive the hell out of here. If Grunt comes out to ask, idle just long enough to say Walt and Gabe went off with someone who came by around noon. You were in the draw, didn't see them. Just heard a car and some conversation you couldn't make out. Then Gabe came to the edge of the draw and said if he and Walter didn't get back here before dark, just to take your wood on out. So that's what you were doing. All this came to me in the space of a half-dozen of those steps I heard moving towards the house. That just showed how wound tight I was. I was so deep in shit I couldn't feel the new waves hit me anymore, just rolled with them. The steps got hollow, climbing and crossing the back porch. 4, 3, 2 more, and he'd reached the back door. That was when, right in front of me, the pick jumped off the ground, twirled in the air, and chunk, started chopping at the slide all by itself, while the shovel came up on its nose, twirled, and chunk, stabbed into the dirt beside the pick. The click and rasp and clank of them rose so biting clear above the cricket noise, such an age-old, unmistakable sound, it seemed you could hear it clear to Healdsburg. Up on the porch, the footsteps stopped. There was a long pause while those tools worked and nothing else moved anywhere on old Uncle's acres. Then came the footsteps again. Creak, thock, creak, thock. Heading back off the porch and down the steps they had just climbed. I still wasn't moving. I was with those god-awful tools, you see, not 3 yards from where they hung in mid-air tearing that slide apart. The terrible magic moving them was like a thickness in the air around them, and it held me fast like a bug in jelly. Not that I didn't finally understand what was happening on this place. I saw it now, I got the gist of it, and I realized that pick and shovel weren't going to bother turning on me, because they had their own row to hoe. But I couldn't move anyway. My legs just wouldn't thaw out. I watched them hack and chew all alone in the shadowy air, and I listened to Grunt's steps coming back. He stopped, the car's trunk popped open, something clanked slightly, the trunk was shut, and the steps came on. It was dark in the draw now, but straight overhead, where I looked like a drowning man might, the sky was still blue and the first star had just showed in it. There was a little piece of my mind like that star, up there apart from me, looking down on the mess I was in. And it told me that when Grunt had paused up on the porch there, that pause had lasted too long for him just to be identifying what this noise was. This noise meant something particular to old Grunt. Though his steps were nearer now, they were quieter, the little grinding noises of his 280 pounds gimping across the grass to the draw. Meanwhile, the pick and shovel had that dirt pouring down like winter runoff onto the draw bottom. Right then, as I was watching, like an island in a stream, a corner of black metal poked out of that runoff. I moved then. I got my feet unrooted, and after that it was easy. I felt so light and small compared to the power that hummed through those tools. I was quick and quiet as a fish in that pool of darkness. I slipped up the opposite slope and behind some oaks. I didn't want to stay even that near to what those tools were uncovering. But there came Grunt Tuggs, limping down the road cut, a 12-gauge pump riot in his right hand, which made that shotgun look no bigger than a breadstick. Dear Christ, old Grunt was big. Barrel-gutted, though beer had made him, his shoulders still made his belly look small. He was balding on top, so his ponytail started from a kind of equator around the back of his head. His face had that full-moon look, puffy, with little slitty, crafty, mean eyes, like a samurai gone to seed on bad sake. He stopped at the foot of the road cut and leaned against the John Deere, hoisting the leg with a cast on it so he could dangle and rest it a minute. That cast was so clean and new and white, and the bulk of Grunt was so oily, dark, bristly, and mean, that it was a little comical-looking somehow, like a party hat on a grizzly. From where he was, he couldn't see the tools past those bushes down the draw, but he knew my truck, and he bellowed out my name. The pick and shovel paused, like a man would do that was startled. It made a shiver go right through me. Then they started digging again. They made the dirt river down wider and wider off that black island. It was the tail end of a black van, tilted almost upside down in its grave. If it hadn't been for that shotgun, I would have run. Grunt called out again. His voice was like a grater blade breaking dirt. "Step out where I can see you, sucker, or I'm going to cut your ass in half. Willie, you hear me? Stop digging and step out." When the tools didn't stop, he started walking down the draw, his moon face bright in the dark, his eyes creased almost shut with anger. And not just anger, maybe a touch of worry, too. Yes, a touch of something I'd never seen on the face of Grunt Tuggs before. And then he stopped and stared, seeing what made the noise he'd thought was me. His head came back and his mouth opened a little. A shudder went through him as he watched the dirt trickling off the old black chassis, lying wheels up. Then his hands remembered the shotgun. He shook his head and heaved his shoulders like throwing off weight. "All right, then, old man," he shouted. His voice was sharp, with a touch of a wild laugh in it. "Okay, if that's how you want it. I've still got plenty of shells, plenty left, so whatever it takes." And he pumped off a wad of double-aught that slammed spang against that shovel's head and sent it twirling like a ballerina on its toe. But just like a dancer, it stayed balanced and spun to a sudden stop. It tipped back once for some thrust and launched itself end over end through the air. That shovel-head swatted Grunt a smack upside the ear that rang like a church bell, and that I know you could hear down in Healdsburg. Meanwhile, the pick had swung up like a pendulum and clouted Grunt's head sideways, clubwise, knocking it halfway back to where the shovel had smacked it from and dropping him on the ground. Grunt got up on one elbow, shaking his head. The John Deere fired up. It roared alive. Its lights came on. It clanked into gear and came chugging and grunting like a giant pig, down-draw towards Grunt Tuggs. The pick and shovel went back to working faster than ever. They looked like two pairs now, with their long shadows in the headlights. And in those lights I could see Grunt still blinking the glaze from his eyes, staring at that old black van that the dirt twisted and snaked off of like something alive, that van that no one had seen for 5 months, along with Uncle and Cherry and Ralph, and all of them together last seen alive by Grunt Tuggs himself. Grunt pushed his chest up off the ground, but still couldn't get the rest of his body moving before the John Deere had reached him. His legs lay dead as cordwood as the John Deere stopped and set the bottom teeth of its skip-loader against the dirt a foot from Grunt. My throat was bulging up towards my mouth like I was going to puke my heart out. Every square inch of me wanted out of that draw, but I had no more muscle to move than a shadow does. The grater grunted, bit down, chewed loose the plug of gravel Grunt lay on, and hoisted him, its jaw drooling pebbles that drizzled down like hungry spit. The handle of the van's rear door twitched downwards once, then again and again and again, and popped the gritty door catch free. The door shoved open with a noise like broken teeth grinding. Ralph stuck his muzzle out into the headlight beams. Those beams showed all the detail of him, the fur clumps dangling from gluey black skin. You could see through the gaps in his snout to the honeycombed bone of him, see the maggots wrestling and crowding and twisting their little tails in there like thousands of tiny flames. Ralph jumped down from the van. His tail, all busy with worms, wagged a little, like he was pleased to see old Grunt. As the dog trotted to him, you could see his left shoulder had a big frayed blast hole blown out of it. Splintered shoulder bone showed like chalk in the moldy muscle. The John Deere lowered Grunt like a waiter bowing. He was struggling his shotgun to his shoulder, but when the scoop banged down, he rolled out, and as his face came up, Ralph set his huge paws on his chest, jawed him by the throat, and clamped his head down hard as iron to the gravel. That was when Uncle came out, and that was when I ran. True enough, I looked before I ran. I saw him plain enough, or most of him, how he had a blast hole in the left side of his chest, and how the headlights made it look black as a moon crater in the crumbly white cheese of his skin, how he had a pipe-wrench in one hand and a pair of bolt-cutters in the other, and how his lizard-skinned fingers had a grip on them like roots on earth. But it was his eyes I didn't want to see. We both knew I was there. I understood that, but I just didn't want to make a personal point of it, eye to eye. So I ran. I was still slick as a shadow. I was scared hollow and light as air. I cut across that slope to the head of the draw as Grunt's bellowing started. I fired up my truck and gunned up the road cut. Jouncing, flinging rollers high and wide, I rocketed through Uncle Tuggs's yard, made the highway, and took off for help. I thought I'd never reach it in time, not before my brain springs started popping out of my ears. But at last I saw that light up ahead. I swung into the lot and jumped out. I ran in and got a 12-pack and a pint of Jack Daniels. Behind the wheel again, breathing a little easier, I took the freeway down to River Road, which I took out to the ocean. I drove slow and worked on the 12-pack and thought about it all. It seemed pretty clear to me when I added it all up that Uncle just had no reason to have it in for me, especially when I'd helped him so much. When I got to the coast, I turned south, and I dumped the firewood and the broken saw off of several cliffs along a 10-mile stretch of Highway 1. It was a good $300 worth of firewood. Somehow, after all I'd been put through, having to do that really pissed me off.